Now that we are done with our hello world formalities, let's take a look at how we create variables in Kotlin. Kotlin allows you to create mutable and immutable variables. Mutable, as the name suggests, the variable you can mutate them or reassign them at a later point. Immutable variable, on the other hand, you cannot reassign them to anything else once they are created. So in order to create a variable, you have to define the types. So let's create an immutable or a mutable variable, name it my variable. You can define the type here, although in Kotlin there is a feature called type inference, so you don't really have to define the type. So let me omit the type here. I can delete the type. Kotlin is a statically typed language, which means the types of any variable, so anything that you define is known at compile time. So even though you do not define the type, because you have assigned a variable value here, it is understood that this is a string. Now this is a mutable variable, so I can reassign this variable to something else and that works just fine. Let's create an immutable variable and we'll call it my immutable. And let's define this, let's give it the value world. Now if I try and reassign this to something else, that's not going to work. As you see, there is a squiggly line which says change it to var. So that is an immutable variable. And we're just going to print this. We're going to use the plus operator to concatenate the two strings, and then we will do another plus and add my immutable variable here. Let's run our hello world again, and that should print hello world. Now, if you notice, the variables I have defined, they have values. So whenever you define a variable, you have to assign a value to it. However, there are instances when you do not know a value and you want to use the variable at a later point. So there is a keyword called late init. So let's say if I remove this value, this is going to be a compile time exception because Kotlin won't allow you to use the variable without assigning it a value. You can do that in Java, but you cannot do that in Kotlin. So in order to fix this, you could use your keyword late init. And if you use a late init, you'd have to define the type explicitly. So I'll have to define it as a type of string, and I don't have to define a value. You can't actually, because you're defining it as a late init. And the catch to this is before you use the late init variable, you have to make sure that it is initialized to something. If you don't, your app is going to crash. You're going to get an exception called uninitialized property access exception. That's because your variable has not been assigned to any value. So in order to use this, you want to make sure that you assign it some value. So just to keep in mind, whenever you're using the late init keyword, make sure that your variable has some value before you use it. And so that's what variables are all about in Kotlin. There's one type as nullable, which means that you can define the variable as nullable. And what that means is this value can be null. So I'll go into a section for nullability in the future section, but for now, I just want you to know that if you have to define a variable that can be null, you want to make sure that you have to define the type as null. And the way you do that, you define the keyword, you define the type, and then you add a question mark at the end and you define it as null, whether you null or some other value. Basically, you're just denoting that this value is null. So that's how you define variables in Kotlin. That's all you need to know, at least for this crash course.